And we're live. Hello, everyone. For our last panel, it was a busy day with a lot of content, and I'm super excited now for this last panel. I'll keep my intro short. What we'll discuss in this session is global mobility and immigration in 2023. We'll do a bit of a recap as well to understand everything that has happened in the past, but then we want to spend some time looking forward, what's yet to come. Because they think overall global mobility changed a lot, especially with the pandemic influencing many changes, general rise of remote work, now the recession. I think the growing location independence of work has resulted in global mobility teams having to manage workforce that are distributed more than ever. And now, almost post-COVID, I would say companies are trying to find the individual long-term solution, with talent also pushing across borders, because now they've seen that a lot of work can be done location independent, and so it is more than likely that global mobility will play a growing role in all of this. And so now we're here to find out what next year will bring. I want to introduce my amazing panelists. Rebecca, who manages global mobility in Intercom, then Cheri, who held a lot of positions in global mobility already, at Slack, Google, Twitter. Colette, who's senior people business partner at Atrium, and then Reece, who's leading global mobility at Personio. But I'll leave it to you now to do an individual intro and also share a bit more about your connection to the topic before we kick off with some more questions. Volunteers for starting.
I can go first because I was the first to be introduced. But as Hannah mentioned, I am Rebecca Kelly. I manage the Global Mobility Programme at Intercom. I'm based in Dublin. I started my career in global mobility in PwC. I moved around myself quite a bit then in London and then in Canada, taking in-house global mobility roles. But I'm back in Ireland where I'm working with Intercom.
I can go next. I am Cheri Martin. I have managed global mobility programs, as Hannah mentioned, in a variety of different places. I ran Google's mobility program for a number of years, Twitter as well, and then most recently built out Slack's global mobility program prior to Slack being acquired by Salesforce, and now I've migrated into some time off.
If we follow Hannah's order, Colette, and I'm based in Amsterdam. I worked for Molly before Atrium, so I just joined Atrium in November. But before that, I was part of Molly's people team. Molly is a fintech scale-up in Amsterdam and has hubs throughout Europe. And I was the people operations lead and responsible for global mobility. We grew massively, which had a huge impact on global mobility as well. So I built out, the global mobility part at Molly back then.
Nice. And I'll finish off the roundup. So I'm Reece, very similar to Rebecca. My background was in global mobility consulting, so with PwC for a long period as well, working in the UK and the Middle East. But took the opportunity this year to lead the global mobility team at Personio, so made the move over to Munich, where I'm based, and leading our international expansion for our global mobility program here.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. And Reece, I think if you have to spend winter in Germany, Munich is definitely the best place with the proximity to the mountains. But first question from my side, on a high level, I know that the last 3 years brought a lot of change. I would love to hear your view on how did that change the way global mobility teams within companies work. I know that there's a lot of different tasks, maybe even different roles. What has changed in the day-to-day, and also how global mobility is maybe seen within companies?
I'm happy to jump in quickly there. I think, as we all know, there's been a massive shift in attitudes and responsibilities for global mobility teams, particularly with people having had to, in many cases, work from home for long periods of time, as you touched upon at the start in your introduction, Hannah. People realise now they don't have to be in an office to be working. So there's probably far more kind of short-term business travel and flexing and people wanting to work internationally. And that's probably a move away from the more kind of traditional longer-term assignments that we saw pre-COVID. So I think there's a lot more responsibility across wider levels of the business to manage those risks, but also there's a lot more visibility for global mobility teams with the exec level, because this has been a hot topic for the past year or two, and it really is on the agenda for everybody. So there's a lot more visibility for global mobility teams as well.
Yeah, and I think too.
Sorry, go ahead, Colette.
Well, and I think what I've seen my time at Molly is that after COVID, we had to think about, okay, what is our setup, right? So do we go for fully remote? Do we go for hybrid? Do we go back to the office? In the end, we decided to go for a hybrid option, but it also had impact on the hiring strategy, which has impact on the business and the HR teams and the people operations team that I led, and global mobility linked to that. So what I saw is that once we went for the hybrid setup and attached to that went for a different hiring strategy, we said, okay, we won't go for a fully remote, which means that the relocation cases increased. So we had to really sort of step up our games in the sense of, okay, who are our partners? What is our package that we offer? Where do we relocate people from? What is our budget? So on a daily basis, that was something we really dived into and focused on right after COVID.
And I would add to what Reece and Colette already said. I think for what I've seen is there's a little bit more catching employees in mobility situations where it used to be the company would facilitate where somebody was going, and now employees are self-selecting into new locations, sometimes letting us know, sometimes not. So I was spending more time trying to figure out where employees were moving to than I had in the past, and making sure that our employees, managers, and recruiting teams were educated on what they could and couldn't do from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, I think the whole compliance perspective is something that I think all can agree on, that we had to sort of, look into that. And what I've also learned is the tech side, social security. I mean, all those topics were quite unknown for me, but I had to really dive into that topic and indeed educate managers in the business in what is possible, or I mean, everything is possible, right? But what are the consequences, and what do we need as a company? Where do we want to go to, and what is the impact if we go for a certain direction? There was indeed a lot of stakeholder management and working with the right partners that can advise you on those topics.
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything that's been said. I think embracing flexibility post-COVID, but kind of within reason and compliantly. So we saw kind of ourselves exploring programs that we wouldn't have in the past, and it's come out of COVID, just like employer of record programs, flexible working. We've definitely seen an increase in employee-driven transfers, because I think coming out of like the couple of years, people kind of have an expectation around flexibility. So have definitely seen kind of those trends.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the last thing I would add would be long-term working vacations in new jurisdictions. I think we saw an uptick in people saying, I'm going to spend the summer in Spain, and then trying to determine from a compliance perspective what support we were going to provide, how we were going to handle any like tax-related things that were triggered, or immigration as well, and just making sure that we were protecting the company and protecting the employee, but also managing costs, because with all of the mobility that we were seeing, temporary mobility in employee-driven, it does add additional costs to the company.
Yeah, and I think like there, it's very interesting also, and the anecdote of more 2020, 2021. I think Canary Islands have been flooded with a lot of tech people, and I would guess that probably 90% did not notify them where they were. And I think like there was a bit of Wild West because there was so much to figure out. And I think like there are a lot of, if I look at 2020, 2021, so kind of like different questions were tackled. How do you see that now? So kind of like what was the theme maybe also for this year, and like what are still the open questions that we need to solve? I think like there's, if I look at 2021, I think like there was a lot about, okay, what is even possible compliance wise, and I think like this year was a lot about hybrid office, etc. And like what are still the big open questions?
Well, what I would say for the next year is, now we already know a little bit more about what is possible. And I think every company already chose for a certain setup is building a foundation. Like, okay, do we have the right policy in place? Do we have the right partners that we can, rely on or work with? What is the package that we can offer? What is our strategy? So creating a little bit more, basic foundation is what I would say.
Yeah, to add to that, I think we've probably all done a lot of learning over the last 12 months in terms of where we've got, but we are still navigating legislation that was written and designed a long time ago for a very different world and a very different set of circumstances. So it's still difficult to find the right solution in that. And as we look towards long-term solutions as well, I think there's so many kind of knock-on impacts for the business in terms of, what does your real estate planning look like? What does your training and development look like for managing kind of fully remote teams if people haven't had that experience before? So there's a lot to consider, not just from a mobility perspective, or not just from the perspective of kind of make sure you're compliant, but also the long-term impacts that will have on the business in terms of its planning as well.
I think one thing that I've been curious about is, I feel like during the pandemic, we lost sight of developmental assignments and sending people for the experience. Maybe there's a business need, but also really it's about developing that individual and giving them a new stretch experience. And so I'm just curious where that's going to go in the future, if like assignments will come back in more of a developmental format, or if people will self-select to develop by moving to a new location themselves. And then, there will be a different structure to that type of assignment. So curious to see sort of where that ends up.
Maybe I think they're diving a bit more into the talent side, I think is very, very interesting, because also preferences change a lot, I think. First of all, it was that new, like the new freedom, the new flexibility. And I think now we also see that there is a need, or not for everyone, but for some people to have an office, to have a space. And I think like they're also finding that middle ground on like, what can we enable? What do we enable? What do we then also request? What are the rules that we set around? And I would love to get your take on that, especially bringing together the global mobility part of, okay, I can enable someone to, for example, spend 3 months in Spain, to like also go somewhere where there's not an office, but then also how do you think about hubs and like really maybe having also different programs on, one is really bringing someone to a different hub, and then that can be longer term, but also the full flexible, you can, I don't know, have the nomad visa to Bali and spend maybe a month there, but like also length of programs, hubs, like how does all of that come together now?
I think it's a really interesting point. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach that will work for everyone. I think it's industry, company, or even role specific as to what would work. But I think embracing flexibility where you can and where works for the business and the employee will always be positive. I think the future is more about intentional meetups. So like you mentioned, hubs. I don't think, the whole mandating office attendance on specific days with no kind of structure or reason behind it will work long term. So I think it's just, we still have a way to go in this space and figuring out kind of what the best balance is for the future.
I know from our experience, we have a flexible working program that gives people the flexibility to go and work, and that is quite often obviously not office based, but that would be more limited in time, I would say. And we've just looked at the data for this year, and the average trip was about 29 days, I think. So it was a good portion of time, but not a huge period of time. But then we had a separate program, a culture carrier program, where people could go for, say, 6 months to another location to aid their development, or to aid the development of newer offices that we have as well, with people who are familiar with the culture of the business. And in that case, then obviously they are office based, but we can still manage that risk. But there is a little bit more permanence to it, in that you are kind of dictating that they are at least based around an office, even if then they can work hybridly in that location and kind of come and go as they choose. But that seems to have worked pretty well for us over the past 12 months.
Yeah, and at Otrium, there is actually a whole different situation going on, whereas the headquarters are in the cloud. So we are fully remote, but then we have 3 office locations, and you can also choose to work hybrid. So it's really super flexible. You can either work remote, you can work hybrid, you can come to the office. So I just started in November, so I'm really interested to see how this goes and how this works. But people, from what I heard already, is that people really love the flexibility, and this doesn't mean that they can work from everywhere. They really they are on either an employer of record contract, or they are based in the office, and they can work from abroad up to 8 weeks. So there is some structure, which I think is needed to sort of keep an eye on people and the compliance side that we already talked about. But that's how Otrium is working right now. But it's a choice, and I think it's managing expectations, educate people, and.
Have you observed any change in behavior from employees? Or, for example, that in the beginning you had a bigger portion that requested that also requested to spend time abroad very flexibly, and right now there's a bigger push to also connect that to hubs, for example. Have you observed anything where, I don't know, for example, what a lot of people say is that initially there was a hype as well around working somewhere close to the beach, but now people actually don't do that much anymore. So I was just wondering, what have you seen there, and what do you also expect still to come?
Well, maybe, and this is personal, it's just a change of scenery sometimes, right? So it's not always book a holiday and then 1 week I would like to work there, and then the other week on holiday. But it's just the fact that your employer trusts you to work from somewhere else in another country, and just have another environment, or just be somewhere else. But that's me personally. But I can also see that from the requests that we get, it's not only Barcelona, Valencia anymore. But yeah, curious to see what you think, panel.
We see a lot of requests around the holidays where people are returning to potentially their home countries and spending it with their families that they may still be there. And I think that that's probably something that had been happening all along pre-pandemic, but it's just something that didn't have as formal of a structure around it. But now, after COVID, with all of the kind of remote working policies, out of jurisdiction working policies, and all of that, we're now capturing that data that previously we wouldn't have been tracking, and it would have been an informal agreement between an employee and their manager. I don't see that going anywhere. We still do have requests to spend, extend a few days at the end of a holiday working, but we aren't seeing it super long-term requests coming through on kind of like, you know, spending 3 months working in the sun. That's not something that initially we did see kind of during COVID, but like it's kind of settled back to kind of a semi-normal state at the moment.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've seen and a shift in with parents is the desire to be closer to family during the summers or when there's school breaks. I think the childcare arrangements changed so much during COVID, and people had become accustomed to having to figure out creative childcare solutions. And now that has become the norm. So versus, you know, sending your kids to camp in the summer, now I think people are like, oh, I can go work from like my parents' house or location or get an Airbnb, and the grandparents can watch the kids. So I'm seeing in the parent group sort of a shift in how they're managing their structure as well.
That's a super interesting aspect, because I think it really depends on the stage you're at. I think like the part about, because I also tried it myself, like if you go to different Airbnbs over a couple of months, like at some point you want to have a better setup again, for example. But at the same time, what I think is really interesting is also something that we are observing is the longer, kind of like also longer term stays, but where you can explore a destination, like also the desire to live somewhere abroad. Like you don't have to do a sabbatical. You can also really say, okay, that's a place I want to really move to, I want to experience. And I think before COVID, for the last 10 years, all of those international trainee programs was something that was also very attractive to young people who might have not done that during university, but who then want to go abroad, maybe half a year, maybe also a year. And I think that's a very interesting aspect, because also what you said about the aspect of learning, kind of like how do you design programs where people can also learn, maybe also transfer to another location where they have employees around, but maybe it's then also for a specific language, maybe even can be combined with, I don't know, a company's desire to move into a certain market, and then employees getting a first-hand feel. I think there's a lot of aspects in the world now that is where companies are thinking internationally early on as a default. And so they're maybe diving a bit more into the aspect of like, do you think it will be maybe the future that you also design specific programs for target groups, and that you just have a bigger diversity of programs?
I definitely think that's the direction that companies will move in. I think when you think about like the original design of, say, an expatriate program, that model hadn't changed much since, you know, in the past 50 years, right? Yeah. But the world has changed quite a bit. So when it was more than 20 years ago, my father went on an assignment when I was in college, and it was necessary for their business to operate. There was still much more difficulty in collaborating remotely. And I think the world has shifted so much that it might be time to just rethink how we're looking at international assignments and what the purpose is, and then design them from what the desired outcome would be, where it no longer is that we need this person in this location so that they can collaborate with the people there. The design will be for a different purpose.
Just to build on that, I think one of the things that I've started to see, and looking at mobility surveys and stuff, is that because people have had the opportunity to spend a couple of years working from home and they've been surrounded by their kids and their family, they're now not necessarily willing to go and do a 2-year assignment somewhere else in another country far away. So what we may see a continued shift towards is more kind of ancillary services to support that relocation on top. So yes, like school searches, housing searches, making sure that the family come as well, and the family feels settled in the location. But then at the other end of the scale, like you say, we've got so many different options in terms of digital nomad visas and flexible working programs, that there really is probably going to be something for everybody, and there's going to be a wide range to manage, but I think it will be a good challenge and a good opportunity as well.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, I think it's still what I've seen, Molly, when we opened up a new tech hub in Portugal, is that we wanted people to be there on the ground to sort of train the people there, bring over the culture. So that can also, I think that continues. If you ask me, it's always good to bring people there for 3 months or 6 months or a year. At least that's what we did to sort of build the culture there and build the company there.
We also have one question from the audience that's kind of tied to that. What trends do you see in terms of relocation packages? I think we touched on it a bit. Reece, you mentioned also school search, etc. What else are you seeing?
I think that I'm seeing a trend toward more sustainability, both for companies and for relocators being interested in this topic. So like more options around discard and donate. I see like IKEA have like a sell and buy back program. We have even just with kind of times for shipments and price increases for household goods, more and more people opting not to use that service. We have a vendor for temporary housing now that you can filter in some locations for sustainability features in the property. So definitely see this in 2023 being more and more important. I'm interested to hear what the rest of the panel are seeing as well.
Yeah, again, flexibility. Flexibility everywhere. So also in terms of the package, I mean, it really depends on if a family with 4 kids are coming over, or just a single person, or just one person with spouse, ranging from different years of age. So it depends also what your need is. And sometimes you see, okay, but I don't want to spend 1 month in a house because then I can stay with a friend. Can I just get the money in a cash bonus? Or so we also try to look at, okay, what is our budget, what do we want to spend on relocation, and then try to see how we can bring back the flexibility there, and try to evaluate certain services, such as a 1 month stay at a hotel, if we can give that to people who don't need that in terms of a bonus, or if you don't need schooling search, what can we offer instead of that? And so yeah, that was actually a really nice project to look into and ask people for feedback on what their needs are and what makes them happy, and how. And in the end, it's the aim to settle people in in their new destination and make sure they feel comfortable as soon as possible. So you have to also be very careful, not only giving a cash option, but also make sure that they at least meet the requirements in terms of visa, but also how can we settle you in and make sure that you are productive, instead of having a poor internet connection at the friend where you're staying at, right? So it's a balance, but it's a really nice way to look at your package.
I'm curious how you guys are seeing if jobs can be done remotely and somebody wants to move to a hub. Are you providing relocation support? How are you handling that where there isn't necessarily a business need for somebody to be in a certain location, but there's an employee desire to be in that location? Are you not, or if you're seeing that at all? I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen it, and it's really it has something to do with your policy, right? So when do you sponsor, and when do you give people a certain package, or is it a light package? Is it a full package? So I think it's important to think about these things also, to be fair and consistent, right? Because some people with the greatest voices get the most, out of it. But in order to be fair and consistent, it's good to think about this. But yeah, yeah. Also curious to hear Rebecca and Reece what they think of this topic.
Yeah, it's something we're definitely looking at the moment. We do want to kind of create a fair and consistent approach to these. So really understanding the true driver of the move. If it's purely employee driven, then it wouldn't receive as much support as, say, there was an open role in the location and an existing employee went to apply for it. That would be kind of considered a full relocation. But yeah, it is interesting, and I think it's something that we're going to see more and more of. Like if it's someone in an actual remote location, depending on like the definition of remote, whether that is kind of our direct employee, like working within a jurisdiction, but just where there's no office, or if they're kind of working through kind of an employer of record program, we would be definitely encouraging a kind of relocation to an office or a jurisdiction where we operate. So I think it's hard to answer kind of a blanket statement on it, but I think it's definitely an area we're looking at, trying to kind of apply some more consistent decisions around.
Yeah, I think from my side, I would echo what was said here. We have previously been pretty generous with people who have kind of requested a move internally, and a case that's personal led has very quickly kind of become business led if we want to keep that person and make sure that we retain that person. And they've pretty much always been given the same terms as somebody who's relocating as a new hire. But again, that's something that we may look at going forwards. But yeah, just to touch on what Colette said as well, we found like a menu of services where people have a budget, but they're pretty much free to spend that as they want, has worked really well, because as you say, every case is so different. Giving people the flexibility there really does help.
There was one question from the audience around that as well, because I think like there are like the fairness aspect. That's also definitely something that we also see a lot. The question is like, if you would pay for housing for relocation, will remote employees also get paid for the home office, or maybe getting a bigger house or apartment, getting support for that? Or like, how do you tackle that? There's also the difference between the remote employees in office, the ones that get relocation.
We would have a stipend for all employees who are remote, like a contribution towards expenses. But for housing, we don't actually do assignments. So if someone wouldn't have their housing paid for, they would have kind of temporary housing for a period when they arrive, while they're finding their permanent accommodation.
Yeah, same.
I think Slack, we went fully distributed pretty early on in the pandemic, and with no expectation that people would ever return to the office. So relocation became something that was pretty rare to support, because there was no need to move anybody. They could stay where they were at and continue to do their job. And we actually invested on the other side in opening new locations. So not on the international side, but domestically within the US, there's a cost and a lift to open up in additional states. And so we would support and provide the support to be able to hire that person in the state that they were currently living in. But we didn't offer them like relocation support to like a hub because we were no longer anchoring to jobs being tied to a specific location. So that was sort of where my question was coming from, because for us, it was so different. And I'm curious in the industry, sort of how companies are approaching things going forward. And now, I mean, much of that has changed post-acquisition. And so now there are people moving and things like that. But for that time period, when we had that policy in place, I would say relocation was usually not on the table as a benefit.
I think like there's a super interesting aspect in there, because also, Reece, I think you mentioned it with before, being very generous and like basically supporting everything. Like that's a case where also global mobility really becomes more and more of a benefit, and less of a also covering business needs. And so there's also a question now, with VC funding in Europe down, increasing layoffs, general economic uncertainty, which pivots or changes do you predict global mobility leaders to need to make in 2023? And I think that's a super interesting one, because like now I feel like the last 2 years there was a lot of employee push as well and expectations. And I think like there's some are still there, and like the best talent will still have choices. So I feel like there's a kind of middle ground that you need to find, but I would love to hear your thoughts on like what pivots will happen, and also how do you see that benefit factor of global mobility long term?
Well, I think if you look at employers of records, I think that is something we will need to focus on in terms of what is the strategy there? How can you make use of employers of records? How do you manage that? I think that could be something that we will see more and more.
Yeah, I would agree there. I think there's companies are trying to solve for how do you spend the least amount of money with the lightest amount of work to get people in the locations where they want to be working. And so solutions around that and how to build out those programs, I think, will become increasingly important. And there's now there's a trade-off of if the cost of relocating somebody and the benefit of them being in that location. So like, is it worth it to, for example, is it worth it to relocate me to New York, or can I do my job from where I'm located right now? And depending on the costs associated and what your package looks like, I think companies are having to make those determinations.
Yeah, and that's actually linked to where do we believe in, or what is the phase our company in, or what type of company are we, what people are working for our company. Can we facilitate working fully remote? Do we is there a combination possible between working hybrid and remote? Can we facilitate both? So are we setting ourselves up for success here? I think there are so many options, but what are the trade-offs? And
Yeah, definitely. I would see a lot of budget holders being a lot tighter on the budget, but for the talent that we need to kind of get through this, I still think relocation and global mobility will still be on the table.
How do you see the role of hubs in that? Because I think it's a super interesting one. Like also then even in the last 2 years, there was that discussion when you want to do hybrid. I think like then you have a certain set of hubs that can be used as middle ground. I think like also there are more and more companies who say, okay, like these are the places where I'm hiring or like where I'm focusing my hiring. I might have some roles that are fully remote, but how do you see that play into, like, especially when we're looking at next year? Will it be more like, will hiring be more focused on certain hubs again? Is it only for certain roles? And like, how does the economic downturn also play into that?
Yeah, so I think there's what I'm seeing like across different companies from benchmarking and friends is that like, everybody's taking a little bit different approach. I think there's on the one spectrum, the companies that are fully remote and like not, there's still some offices that are there for get-togethers and gatherings, but nobody is tied. Nobody needs to be tied to a specific office. And then I would say the majority are in sort of, Hannah, what you had mentioned, this hub and spoke model where you have to be sort of within proximity of an office and go in a couple of days a week. And I think for those companies, mobility is going to become a big component of their hiring strategy, because they will have to bring people closer to those hubs. And there's probably a few companies that are going fully back into the office, but not too many. And I think those outside of our industry, if you think about like a hospital, right? Hospitality, hotels, like those people have to be in the locations where they're working. So there'll be a ton of mobility still happening in those industries.
Just to add to what Cheri said there, I mean, because, you know, we have historically had that hub model as well. So we're European based. We have our offices, and generally the request has always been that people are going to move to one of those offices or be based around one of those offices. But you do also have, you know, with the downturn and with the layoffs here, a kind of unique output of, you know, really talented people globally who have lost their roles, unfortunately. And if you are hiring, then, you know, there's a great market out there for really good talent. And particularly, you know, for us, one of our challenges as we scale is as we move towards a kind of IPO stage, that's a very unique process for a tech company to go through. And there aren't a huge number of people with that kind of particular skill set or who have led other companies through that process. So you do start to look elsewhere and look wider. And then, you know, the US is an obvious example of where there is a lot of talent. But then, yeah, I think you probably hit in any particular market a critical mass at some point when you start to have remote workers because you have the right talent. And at some point, then it becomes, you know, clear that, okay, there's something here more than, you know, a few remote workers. We need to think about, you know, making this a more kind of permanent establishment and setting roots there properly. So I think employer of record models and as collectors and stuff like that gives you the flexibility to test the waters in places and see what's working for you and see if markets are working. And then you have, that flexibility to fall back on. And, you know, once you get to a certain kind of critical mass, then you can build from there.
Anything else to add, or otherwise I'll throw in my next question. We're also coming to, well, I threw in some audience questions, so I'll continue with mine for just a bit more. Maybe overall now trends for global mobility and HR in 23, especially for our audience. What do you think businesses should focus on? What are also resources to look at and maybe people to follow? So where do people look at and where do they get the inspiration from?
I think in 2023, while it's always kind of top of mind for any global mobility professional, I think compliance is going to become more of a focus this year. I think we saw a degree of flexibility offered by a number of governments around the world kind of in the pandemic era. And I think more now than ever, we're seeing kind of increased audits around kind of immigration or otherwise. So I think ensuring that everyone's program is in tip-top shape will be a good focus point for 2023. I think the global mobility community is actually quite tight-knit. So from a resource perspective, I think I've always found great influence and kind of perspective from speaking with other professionals. I think a lot of us work within quite small teams or within limited resources in our organizations, depending on the size, of course. So I've always found kind of having a network of professionals kind of within the regions we are operating in has been super helpful as a resource for me.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with Rebecca. I think compliance, when governments had more flexibility, but also I think companies were more comfortable with risk during the pandemic because there was so much going on. And employees have become accustomed to a lot of flexibility that maybe will go away in the future. So a lot of education of employees, making sure that people know on the compliance side what they can and can't do. And then just really working closely with your partners to see sort of what's happening, keep a trend on what types of audits are coming through with other companies and clients. And then lastly, just leveraging your network. I think mobility has such a tight network of peers that are always eager and open to share and talk. So I think that's one of the things that I love the most about the mobility industry.
I would definitely echo that. I think coming from consulting world into global mobility in-house and seeing, events like this, but also so many times the opportunity to kind of share thought leadership and ideas with other people in the mobility space, and everyone is always very willing to share what they're doing, what's working for them and what isn't. So definitely tap into that network. Internally, think about the key stakeholders that you're probably going to be working with, as I touched upon earlier. Real estate teams for kind of planning what the future might look like. You'll be dealing with kind of reward teams in terms of what remote opportunities look like and how you build up a reward offering that fits a model of having people all over the world potentially, which is very complicated. And what I would really like to see next year is some kind of compliance development from government authorities and immigration authorities to catch up the old legislation that we're still dealing with, and kind of bring it into the 21st century and bring it into the post-COVID world that we live in now, so that there is clearer guidance around remote workers and how they can be treated, so we can start to plan robust policies around that and have that framework for the future.
And I think to add to what all of you said is become data-driven or become even more data-driven. I think there's also a huge win there, especially with everything what's going on right now and budgets that are a little tighter than we used to. It's so important to have your data set to build your business case on, or to create your own budget for the next year. Or there are some amazing tools out there that can support you with getting your data in place, that can sync into your HRIS system, that can manage expectations to the wider business or to your TA team, in terms of how long are the relocation periods for certain countries, what are the costs for certain relocation processes or assignments, and stuff like that. So I think if you're not used to that already, start using your data in order to create your own future next year.
One follow-up question came from the audience on where do you find your network? Any recommendations? Maybe also on events or groups to be joined.
So for anyone who has operations in the US, there's the Bay Area Mobility Management Group. It's called BAM. You don't have to be in the Bay Area to join. And I believe it's free if you're not a vendor or consultant, if you work in-house in global mobility. And pretty robust network, mostly made up of tech growth companies. So I'd recommend that one.
Yeah, and I think I work a lot with the RIN network, certain companies, this Lives International or other bigger companies. They facilitate knowledge sessions for free. So that's also something you can look at too. Summits that are organized.
Cool, thanks.
I would second all of that. Yeah.
Cool. We only have a couple of minutes left. I have one final closing question, more on the visionary side. If you could design an organization from scratch to have the perfect setup from a global mobility perspective, what would the setup be?
Silence. No one wants to touch that question.
Wow.
I would say at least within the current kind of legislation around tax treaties and stuff like that, I think a hybrid model is sensible. I don't think we're ever going to see, where we can support obviously certain roles. It's not relevant, but where we can support, I don't think we will see a return to just being based in the office all the time, because the market has made very clear that it will look elsewhere if you don't offer some kind of flexibility around hybrid working and international working. But there's an awful lot of work in trying to make that just work on a fully international basis when you're talking about permanent establishment risk and compliance risk for individuals in terms of tax. So until the legislation catches up, I think you can build out a hybrid model that gives people the flexibility to take advantage of the ability to work in different places and the ability to work across borders. You can support your business with, hiring remote workers or getting people into the right locations in a kind of structured and build-up basis, and still not have to create too much work for yourself in terms of managing that risk in the background. So you're able to offer that flexibility without making your own life as a global mobility consultant particularly difficult.
I feel like it's a trick question, because what I would want to do for employees, if you think about it from employee experience, would make the most work for global mobility. And so it's like you're always making trade-offs between those two things. How do you manage the compliance and risk and provide a good employee experience? Like ideally, people could just work from wherever they work best all the time. But would be the hardest model to actually implement. And so I think I'm always competing with myself between like what can we do and what administratively is reasonable, and what do employees need and want.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything. But if it's kind of totally visionary, we've got an entity in any location anyone wants to work in, and there's a global mobility dedicated resource in that location as well to manage the compliance. But I think, we're a long way from there.
Yeah, echo everything. Yeah, I think flexibility is key, right? But there are boundaries and there are limits. But yeah, and there's every time a balance between what employees want, but also what the business needs, and it depends on the business and the phase that the business is in. Yeah, but for me personally, hybrid is the best. But that's just a personal note.
Yeah. Thank you. It's an interesting one for me as well, because I feel like we did the opposite of what should be advice, also from a workload perspective, because we had to do the US flip when we were, I think, 5 employees, and then had to manage the US Inc. as a holding, all entities under that. Also added entities in Portugal, Spain, etc. quite early on, because I think for us it also makes sense to get familiar with the jurisdictions. But I think the devil is always in the details. It gave us a lot of learning. So also, for example, now when we got our US team on board, I think that was very fast, because we had a lot of learnings before, but then about what are benefits also in every region, insurances that you need. So some of those minor important things. So yeah, I think it's always a balance. And so I feel like an important aspect is also the communication within the company of what is also possible. And I feel like that was a hard part of the last years, to really say, for people, it was so easy to just go somewhere else. And when they saw that they could do their job, and then doing the explanation of there's something called compliance that no one likes, but it's there. And so I think that was really something now. People are more and more aware of it, and I think it makes it easier. But finding that middle ground, also depending on the stage and the need of the company, is very important. That was my final question. I think also went through all the audience questions. Now in the last 3-4 minutes, just to wrap it up. First of all, big thanks from my side. I really enjoyed it. A lot of insights for me as well. And now I wanted to open up to the panel. Any closing words that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think that what I heard echoed in sort of everyone's responses here was flexibility. And I think that will be the key for the next couple of years, is creating flexibility within the programs, having flexibility with what you're willing and not willing to do, and just trying to be creative in how you're approaching the new challenges of global mobility. I think if we think 10 years out in the future, we have no idea what global mobility will look like. It'll probably look very different than it does today. And so I think just kind of keeping that in mind as you're thinking about how your programs are set up.
Yeah, and I think start with your philosophy, and then build from there, because then you can, everything that you're thinking about, all the different aspects or topics, you can link that to your own philosophy, and that makes it so much more easier to build it out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think adaptability, if the last few years have taught us anything, you could design the most perfect global mobility program out there for the time, and then a pandemic or now the wider economy can have you seriously reevaluating kind of everything and the status quo. So I think being adaptable and being fluid is key.
I would echo all of that. And to the audience member who asked how to build a network, I'm sure you have 4 or 5 people here on the call who would be more than happy to share our experiences and our learnings, what worked for us and what didn't. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. Be happy to share what we've done.
Definitely.
Sure.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Perfectly in time. The link for our final session and wrap up is posted in the chat already. Big thanks also to the audience, for everyone who made it. We'll share the recording as also with the other sessions, and then also don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. And I hope all of you have a great rest of the evening and the day. Cheri, I think for you it's still earlier. So and I hope to see all of you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.